Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I would like to have a look at the Republic of Plato as interpreted by Allan Bloom. This book I have here is Allan Bloom's translation of Plato's Republic, and he goes for a very strict, realistic, accurate translation with as little of his personal touch as possible. It's kind of his aim here. He talks a little bit about translation in the beginning of the book, but he has an interpretive essay in the end of the book, and it's long. It's almost as long as the Republic. It's like over 100 pages, page 310, all the way to page 434. So that's a long essay. And I want to look at that. I don't want to do a lot of interpretation today. I really want to let Allan Bloom do the talking because he's interpreting himself here. So I'm going to just read some sections. This is a 1968 book, and Allan Bloom is a important figure in conservative thought. I haven't read anything of his other than this essay here. Oh, that's not true. Actually, I have read The Closing of the American Mind, I think is the title. I read that one years and years ago, but that's by Allan Bloom. Anyhow, like I said, I don't want to do a lot of interpreting of what he's saying here. I think he gets a lot correct. I'll probably comment a little bit on it, summarize some of what he says to make sure that, we all get what he's talking about, but I want to let Allan Bloom, I want to hear what Allan Bloom has to say about it. So I'm just going to read a few sections here. This is all, by the way, in the beginning of Allan Bloom's essay where he's talking about Book 1. There are 20 books in the Republic, but just the part where Allan Bloom talks about Book 1 that's the part that I want to read. And I think that's the most important book of the Republic, or at least maybe the best book of the Republic. There are a lot of parts of the Republic that I'm not really a fan of. A lot of parts of the Republic seem tyrannical, or seem like they don't take into account what people want, sort of imposes on them what Plato/Socrates thinks is best. But Book 1 is, I think, the most useful and interesting section because he hasn't gotten to his political argument yet, insofar as his argument is like a strictly proposed imaginary city, the Republic of the name of the book. He's still kind of leading up to that conversation. And so he gets a few other conversations. He kind of like lays the groundwork talking about what is justice, and then gets to the construction of his imaginary city in the examination of what justice is. But before he gets to that imaginary city, they're just talking kind of in concrete terms about what justice is. I think that's really the most interesting part. There's a lot of foundational stuff here. He says, quote, "As in the Apology, the city compels Socrates to speak and defend himself. So in the Republic, a group of men compels Socrates to remain with them, and finally to give an account of himself. Apparently he does not wish to do so. Other activities might be more to his taste, and he would like to hurry to them. But these men who accost him have power, and Socrates must adjust to them. If he cannot carry on his preferred activities unimpeded by the need for a compromise with his fellows, he must earn their goodwill and teach them to respect his tastes. Otherwise, he would have to give up his way of life. He will only give as much of himself as is required to regain his freedom. This situation is a paradigm of the relation of the philosopher to the city. The difference between the Republic and the Apology is that the threat of compulsion used in the Republic is only playful, while that of the Athenian law court in the Apology is in deadly earnest. In the Apology, Socrates is condemned to death, because a compromise acceptable to the people would have meant his spiritual death. In the Republic, dealing with a different audience, he emerges as the ruler of a tamed city, which may not understand him, but which is at least willing to permit him the unbridled pursuit of philosophy and access to the noble youth. Socrates had accompanied Glaucon to the Piraeus, both to pray and to see. He was motivated by piety and by theory, in the primitive and most revealing sense of that term, idle curiosity. The Athenians were introducing a new goddess into their cult. Socrates hints that it is the Athenians who bring in new divinities. If he too does so, he only imitates the democracy, with which he has more kinship than appears on the surface. Adeimantus finally persuades Socrates to stay in the Piraeus by the promise of another innovation, a torch race on horseback. The conversation, also an innovation and itself innovating, takes the place of that torch race and is parallel to it. Socrates has a taste for newness which is antithetical to the best political orders, and which he shares with the democracy. The difference between Athenian and Socratic tastes, however, can be measured by the difference between a torch race in honor of the goddess and a friendly discussion about justice. Socrates' piety brings him down to the Piraeus with Glaucon and puts him into the situation where he must discuss the city, and that piety disposes him to care for the city. But his piety is somewhat lax. It is open to change and mixed with curiosity. He does not tell us the result of his prayers, but his observations led him to the recognition that the Athenian procession was no better than that of the Thracians. Socrates' theory stands above the enthusiasm of national pride and is somehow beyond mere citizenship. His piety belongs to the city. His thought does not. Polemarchus sees him hurrying off and orders a slave to order him to stay. This little scene prefigures the three-class structure of the good regime developed in the Republic and outlines the whole political problem. Power is in the hands of the gentlemen, who are not philosophers. They can command the services of the many, and their strength is such that they always hold the philosophers in their grasp. Therefore, it is part of the philosophers' self-interest to come to terms with them. The question becomes, to what extent can the philosophers influence the gentlemen? It is this crucial middle class which is the primary object of the Republic and the education prescribed in it. In this episode, the first fact is brute force, leading to the recognition that no matter how reasonable one may be, everything depends upon the people's willingness to listen. There is a confrontation here between wisdom, as represented by Socrates, and power, as represented by Polemarchus and his friends. At first, the opposition to the two principles is complete, but Adeimantus and Polemarchus try to make Socrates choose to remain by offering him pleasant occupations if he does so. Glaucon accepts on behalf of his friend, and Socrates grudgingly gives in to the fait accompli. Hence, wisdom and power reach a compromise, and a miniature community is formed. This accomplished, they take a vote and ratify their decision, and a new principle of rule emerges, consent. It is a mixture of powerless wisdom and unwise power. All political life will be founded on such compromises, more or less satisfactory, until the means can be discovered to permit the absolute rule of wisdom. Since he is forced to become a member of this community, Socrates soon establishes himself as its ruler, by overcoming the other aspirants to the office, and then he proceeds to found a political regime in which philosophers will rule. End quote. So that is an awesome introduction to the beginning of the Republic. So Socrates has gone to the Piraeus, which is, I guess, like the docks, the area that's most accessible to the water, and it's like a part of Athens. And there's some sort of a festival or ritual or something to a new goddess being introduced to the city by the leaders of the city. So this is a kind of interesting point about how in the Apology he was accused of bringing new gods and goddesses to the city, but here Plato sort of accuses the city of being the ones to introduce the new gods and goddesses. So that's an interesting thing and it reinforces the comparison that Allan Bloom makes here, and I think he's dead on where he talks about the connections between the Apology and the Republic, and the connection between Socrates' position as a philosopher being tried and executed by the city, and this scene here where he's grabbed by his friends and kind of taken off to have a conversation about philosophy, where he sort of kind of has to give an account of himself. And he doesn't exactly have a choice in the matter. And this is an analogy or a metaphor, I guess, for the political situation as a whole, the political situation in Athens and maybe the political situation everywhere. And then you begin to realize, I think, reading this and seeing that Allan Bloom has really gotten this right, you begin to see the depth of Plato's writing. This is so long ago, and yet the symbolism, I guess, of the scene and the characters and what he's writing about and how it sort of stands for things. And you've got this torch race on horseback. And I guess at the same time that the horse race is happening, or at least in some sort of, I think the horse race is something that's anticipated, and they talk about it. They also wind up having this conversation, and Allan Bloom says that's a sort of metaphor as well for this ongoing political discussion. But you've got these noble gentlemen who send their slave after Socrates, and that's an analogy of how the nobility has power over the masses and can use them to get philosophers to bend to their will. And the problem is the power without wisdom and wisdom without power. It's just interesting how this is kind of just the very first scene in the Republic. All this is getting laid out, but not explicitly, just by analogy. It definitely prompts me as a reader to want to take the Republic seriously and to understand that it's not necessarily all just what Socrates. There's an interesting discussion of how much of the Republic is what Socrates believed or what Plato believes, or is intended to illustrate an argument and where it goes without actually subscribing to it, in a way to propose something that's completely unserious as a way to prove the impossibility of rule by philosophy. There are many ways to interpret this book, obviously. So let's keep moving. He introduces the character of Cephalus, which is a character that I like. He says, quote, "Having made their social contract, the members of the group go to Polemarchus's house, where they find his father Cephalus, who dominates the scene, and who does so precisely because he is the father. Age is his title to rule, and it is in almost all regimes governed by ancestral custom. Age is a practical substitute for wisdom, because unlike wisdom, it is politically recognizable and easily defined. It is more feasible to teach force to respect age than to teach it to respect wisdom. The reverence for age, and hence antiquity, is one of the strongest ties which can bind a civil society together. But in order to carry on a frank discussion about justice, this reverence must be overcome, and the philosopher must take the place of the father at the center of the circle. Socrates must induce Cephalus to leave the scene, because Cephalus is beyond reason, and it would be impious to dispute him. Once authority has been banished, Socrates and his companions can begin a critical examination of the ancestral code, of the conventional view of justice. This is the burden of the rest of Book 1. All traditional opinions are discredited, and unaided reason, free of limiting prejudices, can begin the search for an understanding of justice which is not merely opinion. This criticism is a destructive activity in the name of liberation. It is a perilous undertaking for men who must remain members of civil society and could not properly take place under the eyes of Cephalus. He stands for those restraints on body and soul which are essential to the preservation of the city. There are certain uncomfortable issues, the raising of which usually indicates an inclination to vice on the part of those who do so. The practice of posing the extreme questions is a bad one, for one of its necessary consequences is corruption of the habits of the virtues. The only justification for questioning the old ways would be that as a result a new superior way, which Cephalus does not know of, might emerge. The ancestral is, by its nature, silent about its own foundations. It is an imposing presence that awes those who might be tempted to look too closely. Cephalus typifies the ancestral, which cannot but must be questioned. Although his appearance is brief, by means of a few circumspect inquiries, Socrates manages to reveal his character and his principles, and hence those of the tradition he represents. Then the old man is delicately set aside. He is a father in the fullest sense. He was once very erotic, and he possesses a considerable store of money. He presents himself as a lover of speeches, and thereby a friend of Socrates. But he loves speeches only in his old age, and it is doubtful whether he considers that his prime. The passions of youth led him to bodily pleasures, and it is only with the body's decline that he turns to the things of the soul. For Cephalus, speeches are a way of spending his old age. For Socrates, they constitute the highest human activity. Cephalus's youthful passions, however appealing, seem to have led him into activities that are contrary to justice, and his old age is spent worrying about them and atoning for them. Thus, from the point of view of justice, Eros is a terrible thing, a savage beast. For a man like Cephalus, life is always split between sinning and repenting. Only by the death of Eros and its charms can such a gentleman become fully reliable, for his Eros leads neither to justice nor philosophy, but to intense private bodily satisfaction. Cephalus says that it is character, an attribute of the soul, which enables him to be contented in old age. Socrates poses a rather crude question. Doesn't money help? Aren't the things with which Cephalus is concerned really tied to money? Isn't the insistence on character merely a way of hiding the fact that dependence on money and of attributing one's happiness to oneself rather than to the true material source of one's well-being? Must not the overriding concern of private men, families, and cities be the acquisition of wherewithal? The answer is yes and no. Cephalus would be very different and much less happy without money. He is not like Socrates, who is poor and needs nothing more, but Cephalus is not a simple money-maker. Money is necessary, but it frees him for the fulfillment of certain family and religious duties which sublimate his life. He inherits the money, and whatever improprieties were committed in the first making of it are lost in the mists of time. It would be unseemly and lead to an undue concentration on money if one were to insist too much on its importance. Characteristic of Cephalus and men like him is a salutary forgetting of the preconditions of their kind of life. The greatest good Cephalus has enjoyed from money is the avoidance of injustice and impiety. Here, for the first time, we touch on the subject which is to become the theme of the Republic. The question of money seems to lead him to the question of justice. The old man is afraid of punishment after death, so he does not want to depart owing debts to men, or sacrifices to gods, or having cheated or deceived anyone. With his money he can pay his debts and offer his sacrifices, and because he possesses money he is not so dependent on others that he need deceive in order to stay alive. The tales told by the poets about punishments in another world for injustices committed in this one concerned Cephalus little when he was younger. He was inclined to laugh them off. Accordingly, he worried little about injustices he might be committing. Only as death, and death's perspective, approaches, does fear cause him to become concerned about his duties to men and gods. He is not sure that there are such punishments, or even that he had really done unjust deeds, but prudence counsels a punctilious attention to his accounts with men and gods. Justice is a matter of self-interest. One should care about others if there are gods who defend justice. In response to Cephalus's moving account of how he wishes to use his money in such a way as to live out his life in justice and piety, Socrates becomes argumentative. Instead of encouraging the old man in his laudable intentions, Socrates as much as tells him that he does not know what justice is, and thereby undermines his life. This is one of the most decisive moments of the dialogue, for with his question, Socrates takes command of the little community, forces Cephalus to leave, and makes the nature of justice the problem of the discussion. Socrates acts as though Cephalus had tried to define justice and objects to the definition he himself constructs out of Cephalus's statement. Justice, according to Socrates' rendition of Cephalus's view, is telling the truth and paying one's debts. Socrates' procedure is quite strange. In the first place, he says nothing about half of what interests Cephalus. He does not mention piety. Whether this is because he thinks Cephalus's understanding of piety is adequate, or because he is not interested in piety. Second, in his discussion of paying one's debts, Socrates is silent about the gods and the sacrifices owed to them. In a word, Socrates forgets the divine, which is Cephalus's prime preoccupation, and makes the discussion one concerning human justice alone. This, along with his unwillingness to face the fact that he might be ignorant of the very obligations he is trying so hard to meet, is what causes Cephalus to leave. While the discussion is going on, he is elsewhere performing sacrifices to the gods, concerned with what is forgotten in that discussion. Socrates' objection is very simple. Everyone knows that it is just to pay one's debts, but everyone is also aware that there are occasions when one need not and should not do so. Thus, it is impossible, without contradicting oneself, to say that justice is paying one's debts. One must seek a non-contradictory definition of justice. Cephalus, too, is aware that one must sometimes deviate from the principles of justice in the name of justice, but he has never considered what the consequences of that fact are. He must adhere to the laws, human and divine, or he would have to spend his time in finding out what justice is rather than in doing it. If everyone had to decide whether the law is properly applied in each case that arises, the political result would be anarchy, and individually, a task beyond the capacities and energies of most men would be imposed on them. For Cephalus, the just is identical to the law of the city, and the law is protected by the gods. The problem of justice is simply expressed in his view. If there are no gods, there is no reason to be just or to worry. If there are, we must simply obey their laws, for that is what they wish. But common sense tells us that laws are not always conducive to the good of those they are intended to benefit. Cephalus, however, is content to forget this fact in his sacrifices, even though his actions may be harming others. His light-hearted piety can seem extreme selfishness. He leaves to his son the considerations of what is truly good for other men, for it would force him to make a distinction between the just and the legal. And he leaves to all thoughtful, selfish men the consideration of what the profitable life would be if there are no punishments after death. The unity of things, expressed in the identification of the just and the legal under the protection of the gods, has been rent asunder by Socrates' simple objection to Cephalus's assertion that a man should pay his debts. Now the members of this group must try to find out what justice is, and whether justice is good for the man who practices it. Although the definitions of justice proposed by Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus are all found wanting and must be abandoned, the discussions concerning them are not simply critical, nor is their result only negative. From each, something is learned, which is of the essence of political life, and which is reflected in the final definition and the regime that embodies it. From Cephalus, we learn that for most men, justice can mean only law-abidingness, and that rewards and punishments in this life and the next are necessary to ensure obedience, which does not seem to them desirable in itself. Cephalus's definition fails because it cannot account for those instances in which one is admittedly exempted from obeying the law. He has no grasp of the intention or principle of law. He believes in the sanctity of private property. Injustice is taking what belongs to others. Justice, respecting what belongs to them. Belonging is defined by the law. But insanity and the intention to injure are sufficient grounds for taking away from a man what is thought to belong to him, rationality and goodwill, or to put it otherwise, capacity to use a thing well, and attachment to the community and its laws are apparently conditions of the respect of a man's right to ownership. The simple example of the insane man who demands the return of his weapon, if generalized, leads far from the letter of the law, which men like Cephalus must respect. It becomes Polemarchus's responsibility to explain what standard should be looked to when one deviates from the letter of the law, which is equivalent to stating the purpose for which laws are instituted. End quote. Okay, so that's a huge section there about Cephalus, who is, I think, an interesting character. And he's only in very briefly because he leaves soon. He's Polemarchus's father. He's old school. He's pious. They talk a little bit about money. They talk about whether, being old sucks or not. And, that's kind of the question. Like, is it as bad as they say to get old? And they talk a little bit about being old. And Socrates is kind of like, well, isn't it really money that has allowed your old age to kind of go smoothly? Isn't it just the fact that you have money and not a question of your character or anything else about how you're dealing with? And he's kind of, I guess, Socrates is a little bit rude to this old man for being like the father of the house, the head of the household, and, an elder who should be respected. And Socrates just sort of questions him, and they get into talking a little bit about what justice is, and then Cephalus bounces to go do the rituals and leaves the discussion to the rest of them. But Cephalus really just believes that if you follow the law, the laws are instituted by the gods and supported by the gods, and if you follow the law, then you're doing the just thing. If you pay your debts and you don't, commit injustices against people, or you repay them if you have, and you make your sacrifices that are demanded of you, if you do what is demanded of you by the simple basic laws of justice, then you're being just, and that's kind of what you should do. Now, what's interesting here is that Socrates says, well, is it just if someone goes insane and they want their weapon, they want their sword, and they're going to hurt an innocent person with it if you give it to them, should you give it to them even though it belongs to them? It's like, should you give a drunk driver their keys or not? Is it really a matter of what belongs to you? That is the question of what belongs to who. Aren't there other things that define justice beyond that? Isn't there some higher thing than the law? And that's kind of what it comes down to. Isn't there something that would provide an exception when you shouldn't just pay the debt, when you shouldn't just follow the commands? Is there some deeper meaning of justice beyond what is the law or what the gods demand? Or, beyond the simple premise of private property, I guess, is where Socrates sort of goes with it. One thing that I want to point to, though, is he says, in a word, Socrates forgets the divine, which is Cephalus's prime preoccupation, makes the discussion one concerning human justice alone. So Socrates steers the conversation toward human justice and doesn't talk about the gods much. Even though Cephalus talked about the gods, Socrates just is kind of silent on the issue, doesn't talk about it much, and talks about justice amongst the people. He does talk about the gods a little bit, but certainly not does not make it a preoccupation like Cephalus does. But anyway, shortly afterwards, Socrates' objection is very simple. Everyone knows that it is just to pay one's debts. But everyone is also aware that there are occasions when one need not and should not do so. Thus, it is impossible without contradicting oneself to say that justice is paying one's debts. Well, what do we have here? A couple of important statements. Everyone knows, and that's the most important two words in this section. Everyone knows that it is just to pay one's debts, but everyone is also aware that there are occasions when one need not and should not do so. What does everyone know? How does everyone know this? What does it matter whether everyone knows it or not? He makes an appeal here, and Socrates makes this appeal as well, that an appeal to common knowledge, an appeal to what the common person believes. Everyone knows this to be true. And that's kind of the justification of it. Now, there's certainly parts where Socrates questions common wisdom and questions what people commonly understand. But in the conversations that Socrates has with the other people, he'll say things like, "Don't you agree?" So, well, justice is this situation of paying one's debts, but wouldn't you agree that it's not just to give a psychopath his weapon if you know he's going to hurt someone with it? Wouldn't you agree that it's not just to give a drunk driver his keys? Wouldn't, he asks for them to agree with him. And there's a point where it boils down to something that's just commonly understood, right? It's just like, oh, obviously this is the case. There's a sense of, right? William James talked about the sense of rationality. It's like that. It's like he appeals to the person he's talking with, appeals to their sense of rationality, and then they say, well, yes, obviously, of course, that's the case. Clearly, there's no rationality there. That's not a rational question in the sense of like, if this, then why. There's a sort of sequence of logical consequences of antecedent circumstances, and that's reason and rationality. But if you just appeal to something and it's an instinctual, oh, obviously, that's a little outside of rationality. So he appeals to something outside of rationality, which is like a sense, a moral sense, an intuitive sense, a logical sense. People have these senses. And so when he says, what is justice? It's this, it's that, it's the other. But like always, he defaults to what the person senses as justice is given a pass as like, you sense that this is justice to not give a psychopath his weapon. I also can sense that it's not justice. If you do that, justice must be something more than just paying one's debts. I can sense it. I can intuitively know it. And that's really where the end appeal always goes to. In the dialogue format of Plato. Oftentimes, in this book especially, but also the other books where he'll just look, Socrates is looking for agreement from the person he's talking with. And that agreement provides them with, especially if multiple of them agree. If one of them still has a contention, then the discussion, and then when everybody agrees, they move on. There's something sort of in the consent of the participants in the discussion that allows them to put a pin in what things are and what things aren't. To say that something is so, or to say that it is not so, when everyone agrees that it's so, then that's how they know. There's an appeal to something like democracy in the philosophical discussion, and there's an appeal to something outside of rationality. And although they continually ask, what is justice, they never quite say, well, justice is whatever it is inside of us that causes us to all say, oh yeah, obviously, that's justice, that's not justice. Justice is whatever that inner eye sees and names as justice. Maybe that would be an insufficient answer. Anyway, he moves on here to Cephalus' son, Polemarchus, who continues the discussion. He says, quote, Polemarchus inherits his father's duty of defending the law, and hence of defending that property which he is going to inherit. He fails in his attempt to define justice in a way which is consistent with the maintenance of private property, and the Republic culminates in the elaboration of a regime in which the only title to property is virtue, and which is hence communistic. Polemarchus's original intention, when he interrupted, was merely to support his father's contention that one should pay what is owed. He does so by citing the authority of a poet. In this case, however, as opposed to that of Cephalus, poetic authority apparently does not refer to the even greater authority of the gods. He expresses his own view. Socrates can, with greater propriety, call into question the opinions of the young Polemarchus based on the authority of Simonides than the dogmas of the pious old Cephalus based on the authority of the traditions about the gods. But even here, Socrates does not criticize the authority. He merely asks Polemarchus to interpret. Socrates makes the ironic assumption that Simonides must be right, and that since he is right, his views must accord with the results of rational argument. Polemarchus is compelled to learn how to argue. This is the first step on the road from unconditional acceptance of the ancestral order to the new regime based on reason, in which the authority of the father's opinions and the power of his property play no role. By the end of his discussion with Socrates, Polemarchus is aware that he cannot get help from Simonides, and that he must himself find reasons if he is to be satisfied with his beliefs about justice. Finally, he and Socrates join in agreeing that Simonides could not have said what Polemarchus asserted he said, for it is unreasonable and base. Simonides remains respectable, but only because it is assumed that he accepts the authority of Polemarchus and Socrates, who are now free of him. Polemarchus is the last participant in the discussion who attempts to use an authority as a sufficient cause for belief. Immediately after him comes Thrasymachus with his own definition of justice. Polemarchus insists that justice is paying what one owes, but Socrates again poses the same objection that silenced his father. In order to save his definition, Polemarchus must alter the sense of owing. Now, justice is not giving back to any man what he has deposited, but giving good things to friends. In general, this would mean following Cephalus's rule, but it accounts for the exceptions. One need not aid a man who intends to do one damage. He must be a friend, and one must look to the good of the other party, as Cephalus did not do. Two great themes emerge: friendship, or community, and the good. Infinite themes which it now becomes necessary to understand, if one wishes to understand justice. Polemarchus, of course, does not recognize what has happened, for he does not see any problem in knowing what is good for a friend. Socrates explains Polemarchus's definition of justice: doing good and no harm to friends, in terms of the example he used to embarrass Cephalus. A thing is not owed if it works harm to render it, but Socrates changes the thing deposited in this case. It is money, not a weapon. This small change is most revealing, for it broadens the scope of the exceptions and changes their sense. Cephalus would not return the weapon because its owner might hurt him with it. His justification is the selfish one of his own defense. Justice must be practiced until it is manifestly harmful to oneself. Money in the hands of a madman is not so manifestly dangerous to another man as is a weapon. If one withholds his money, the justification for so doing is not likely to be that he will harm others, but rather that he will harm himself. Now the focus of attention is on what it does to the one who receives, rather than to the one who gives, a question to which Cephalus was profoundly indifferent. Cephalus was interested in what justice would profit himself. Polemarchus is interested in advantage for others. He is really much more of a gentleman than his father. He presents the other side of the problem of justice, the good it does the community, as opposed to the individual. The relation between justice conceived as one's own good and justice conceived as the common good is the abiding concern of the Republic. Cephalus and Polemarchus represent the two poles. Also at this point, with the recognition that a man's property and money only extends so far as he can use that money well, only so far as it is good for him, private property becomes radically questionable. After more prodding by Socrates, Polemarchus is led to complete his definition by asserting that enemies are owed harm. Justice is benefiting friends and harming enemies. This is Polemarchus's and the gentleman's view of justice. As Lessing approvingly put it, for the ancient Greeks, moral greatness consisted in a love of friends that is as constant as the hatred of one's enemies is unchanging. Although Socrates finds this understanding of justice ultimately inadequate, he clearly agrees with Lessing that it is the formula for gentlemanly and heroic nobility and higher than most alternatives. It sounds harsh to our ears, for it is far from the morality of universal love to which we are accustomed, and we must make great efforts if we are to understand its dignity. That dignity consists in unswerving loyalty, loyalty to the first, most obvious attachments a man forms, loyalty to his family and his city. Our admiration for this character is manifest in our horror at the man who is willing to betray family or friends for gain, out of fear, or even in the pursuit of an ideal. Such loyalty seems natural, for it springs up in us with our own first appetites and tastes. It is identical with love of our own. It does not have the abstract aspect of the love of humanity, which a man cannot know in its entirety, a love which does not make distinctions among men. It is more powerful because of its exclusiveness. It stays within the limits of possible human concern. But although many might be willing to admit that one's duties toward one's own take precedence over those towards mankind at large, it might well be asked why it is necessary to harm enemies, or why there need be enemies at all. The answer is twofold. There are unjust men who would destroy the good things and the good life of one's own family or nation if one did not render them impotent. And even though there were not men who were natively unjust, there is a scarcity of good things in the world. The good life of one group of men leaves other groups outside who would like and may even be compelled to take away the good things of the first group. To have a family or a city that is one's own implies the distinction between insiders and outsiders, and the outsiders are potential enemies. Justice, as helping friends and harming enemies, is peculiarly a political definition of justice, and its dignity stands or falls with the dignity of political life. Every nation has wars and must defend itself. It can only do so if it has citizens who care for it and are willing to kill the citizens of other nations. If the distinction between friends and enemies, and the inclination to help the former and harm the latter, were obliterated from the heart and mind of man, political life would be impossible. This is the necessary political definition of justice, and it produces its specific kind of human nobility, expressed in the virtue of the citizen. Socrates does not simply reject it, as he appears to do. The warriors in his best regime, whom he compares to noble dogs, share in the most salient characteristic of noble dogs: gentleness toward acquaintances and harshness toward strangers. This is the key to the strengths and weaknesses of the political man. Socrates' analysis of the definition is divided into 3 parts. 1. A discussion of how one can do good to friends. 2. An attempt to define a friend. And 3. A critique of the notion that a just man can do harm. Socrates begins by asserting that Simonides meant that the ode is the fitting. The deposit is no longer important. Whether a man has deposited something or not is irrelevant. The only consideration is what is fitting for him. Justice might mean depriving him of what he thinks belongs to him, or giving him something to which he appears to have no claim. In this reformulation, doing good to friends and harm to enemies is equivalent to giving to each what is fitting. Polemarchus meant that one gives to friends the things they want, and denies to enemies the things they want. Socrates changes Polemarchus's meaning by concentrating not on the wants of men, but on what is objectively proper for them. A sick friend is justly treated when given medicine, whether he likes it or not. This shift in emphasis implies that the primary concern of the just man must be something Polemarchus has never considered. What counts is not so much the disposition to give good things to friends, but knowing what those good things are. Justice must be some kind of knowledge. Therefore, Socrates turns to the most evident, perhaps the only sure models of knowledge of what is fitting, the arts. A doctor wishes to give what is fitting to bodies and knows what is fitting and how to give it. The just man, if he is to succeed in his intention, must also possess an art. Now the problem becomes to identify the art of justice, which, to put it mildly, common sense does not apprehend so quickly as it does the other arts. Formally, it must be the art which gives good to friends and harm to enemies, just as cookery gives seasoning to foods. However, it immediately comes to light that justice is not the only art capable of benefiting friends and harming enemies. Medicine and navigation are of even greater use than justice to men who are sick or sailing. As a matter of fact, each of the arts aims at some good, and hence each is capable of working the benefactions or injuries called for by the definition of justice. The question is to find what justice does that no other art does. And this is obviously a difficult, or rather an impossible task. Polemarchus suggests that justice is most useful and indispensable in the affairs of war and in peacetime, in keeping money deposits. This response is more helpful for learning about Polemarchus's view of justice than for solving the problem of justice's subject matter. The connection of war and money is obvious, and the kind of good things Polemarchus means, and the sense in which the just citizen is a warrior, emerge more clearly. But as he does in the other cases, Socrates could easily show that a skilled soldier is a better partner in war than a just man, and a trained banker is a better partner in peacetime than a just man. Socrates has indicated by the examples he uses that for Polemarchus at least, justice is concerned with the acquisition and distribution of good things in communities of men, while keeping off the outsiders. The extraordinary result of this conversation is that justice is useless in the enterprise of doing good to friends and harm to enemies. What has happened is that Socrates and Polemarchus discovered that the world is divided up among the arts, and there is nothing left for an art of justice. A doctor may do good to his friends and hence be just, but justice is nothing beyond the exercise of his art, which is something other than justice. Arts are the means of doing good and harm. Arts have subject matter, but justice does not. Hence, justice is not an art and cannot do good. Justice has disappeared. End quote. Okay, so that's another extended section. I think all these sections I'm reading are fairly long, which is fine. He's going into a lot of detail about the conversation with Polemarchus. And Polemarchus has changed the definition of justice from giving people what they're owed to doing good things to your friends and bad things to your enemies. Doing good things for your friends. Doing what is good for your friends, let's say, and doing what is bad for your enemies. Helping your friends and hurting your enemies. But Allan Bloom points out, and I think Socrates also kind of gets to, like, the question here, that if you're doing good things for your friends, if justice is doing good things for your friends, and for people, well, let's look at it a little differently. Let's say if there are people that you care about, you don't want harm to come to them. You want good things to come to them. You want the people that you care about to be successful and have good lives. Let's say that. You want good things for your friends. And if somebody is out to harm you, then you want them to be punished, right? There's an aspect of punishment in justice. If somebody is a threat to you, you want them to be, you want some means of protecting yourself from that threat. You want them prevented from enacting their violence. There's some aspect of that in justice as well. But you have to know what's good, and you have to know what's bad, and you have to know who your friends are, and you have to know who your enemies are. And there's a lot of knowledge here in this more than anything else. Justice is the knowledge of what the good is. So you might have friends, and you might think that what is good for them is this, but what is good for them is actually that. Justice is, in a sense, knowing what is good, more so than just doing what you think is good. You could do what you think is good and have it not be good, and then would justice have been enacted? And it gets pretty in the weeds here. Is justice something that's reliant on consequences? Do just acts rely on good results? Can just acts have unjust results? Are they still just acts if they do? If something has good intentions but ends poorly, was it still a good act? Was it good on account of its intentions, or do the consequences come into play, or are the consequences the only thing that really matters in the question? There's certainly a lot buried in this question about doing good things for your friends and harming your enemies. But yeah, he talks about it as a sort of skill. It's a knowledge, then it's sort of like a skill. What is the particular skill? And it seems it gets a little off track here, talking about like whether justice is best displayed in the art of the banker during peacetime and the soldier during wartime. That seems like it's getting off topic here. Anyway, I'm going to jump to the continuation of his discussion of Polemarchus's ideas, really the fall of Polemarchus's ideas. He says, quote, Socrates insists on pointing out that the arts are neutral, that they can affect opposite results with equal ease. This fact is particularly shocking to Polemarchus, for its consequence is that the practitioner of the art of justice would be as adept at stealing as at guarding a thing, and would lie as well as he tells the truth. Nothing in the art would guide a man as to what he should do. He would merely be technically proficient. Instead of being the model of reliability, the just man becomes the archetype of untrustworthiness, the possessor of power without guiding principle. He is a thief and a liar, the contrary of the debt-paying, truth-telling just man defined by Polemarchus's father, a definition which Polemarchus has inherited and the substance of which he is trying to defend. Of course, it has been admitted that the just man sometimes would not pay his debts, and would even lie to his friends, so the result of this argument should not be surprising. But Polemarchus is unwilling to accept it. He is a gentleman, and there are certain things, dishonorable things, a gentleman is never supposed to do. He may admit that they must be done, and even do them, but he refuses to recognize the consequences of what he does. If he did so, it would seem to end in the loss of all standards. Life is ordered according to fixed rules, and the exceptions are hidden in silence. Polemarchus could be accused of hypocrisy, and the limitations of his kind of moralism are exposed here. Socrates hints that the good things which Polemarchus defends might well have been acquired in less than decent ways, the memory of which is lost in the mists of time. But even worse, his character is such that he would probably rather work harm than use ungentlemanly means to a good end. Socrates, as the Republic reveals, is not averse to lies, and is certainly no respecter of private property. However that may be, the assumption that justice is an art does lead to serious difficulties, expressed ironically in the notion that the just man is both useless and a thief. It would seem that arts require particular subject matters, and that they are morally neutral. We are forced to abandon the assumption, and one might very well ask why it was made in the first place. We all sense that justice is a disposition, as Cephalus originally suggested, one which every man must possess in addition to his skill. A doctor must be disposed to heal his patients, as well as be able to do so. Otherwise he might just as well kill them for profit as cure them. Just why did Socrates turn the conversation in this direction? In the first place, it must be remembered that, with the banishment of Cephalus, ancestral authority was replaced by what men can know for themselves, by the evidence of reasoned experience. The arts are the most obvious sources of knowledge, available to all men as men, without the need of any active faith or the instruction of a particular tradition. The desire to know what one owes other men would most immediately lead in the direction of trying to discern an art which can guide us, just as medicine guides us in the matters of health. Moreover, however much habit may play a role in the character we call just, it is also clear that it is simply insufficient for a man to follow rules without any knowledge of the reasons behind them. Cephalus is proof enough of that. Our doctors are supposed to obey the Hippocratic Oath, and that obedience would in a sense make them reliable, but ultimately, the most important thing is the knowledge of the goodness of that oath, of the reasons why following it is salutary. The worthwhileness of a doctor's activity depends on this, and no matter how technically proficient he may be, his talents are useless or dangerous if there is no knowledge about this first question. Justice necessarily and primarily demands a knowledge of what is good for man and the community, otherwise the knowledge and skills of the arts are in the service of authoritative myths. Now this discussion with Polemarchus outlines in a negative way what the character of the requisite knowledge must be. It cannot be like any of those arts which are always present in any community, shoemaking, weaving, carpentry, etc. This is what Socrates meant in the Apology, when he told of his quest for wise men. Poets and statesmen, he found, knew literally nothing, whereas artisans did indeed know something. Unfortunately, their knowledge was limited and partial, and Socrates said that he would prefer to be ignorant as he was than knowledgeable as they were. For they were content with their competence and closed to the larger questions. To be ignorant, in Socrates' way, is to be open to the whole. The artisans are models of knowledge, but their kind of knowledge is not applicable to the domain of poets and statesmen. The problem is to combine the concerns of poets and statesmen with knowledge, as artisans possess it. Such knowledge is what Socrates is seeking. End quote. So here he's criticizing the idea that justice is an art, and he differentiates a bit between knowledge and an art, and he talks about intention. He talks about the doctor, and he says it's not really enough for the doctor to know how to heal someone. It's not even enough for the doctor to follow the Hippocratic Oath of not harming people. The doctor doesn't just have to know, and this is a distinction that's important, and sometimes it can get misstated. The doctor doesn't just have to know what is good for the patient. The doctor doesn't just have to know that he's supposed to do good things. The doctor has to feel a compulsion toward goodness. The doctor has to want to do good. And that's so, in a sense, it's beyond just knowledge. Socrates is obsessed with thinking about knowledge of the good, but he doesn't say that exactly, but he hints at it. He says the doctors are supposed to obey the Hippocratic Oath, and that obedience would, in a sense, make them reliable, but ultimately the important thing is the knowledge of the goodness of that oath. Right? So you know that the Hippocratic Oath is good. What does it mean to know that the Hippocratic Oath is good, as opposed to feeling that the Hippocratic Oath is good? As opposed to having some... You can know that it's good, but if you don't feel compelled toward good, what use is that knowledge? Anyway, at the end, he just kind of ends up here saying that none of the arts are adequate. There's a knowledge of the good that Socrates is after, and it's going to have to be found sort of somewhere else, somewhere outside of the arts. Even though the arts are sort of the first place to go when you think about good as a knowledge, you'd say, okay, well, what about other knowledges? And it makes sense, but it's ultimately inadequate. So, talking further about the whole concept here of helping your friends and hurting your enemies, which he goes into in a little more detail, he says, quote, "The discussion with Polemarchus leads to the same result as the questioning of the artisans described in the Apology. The artisans are found insufficient, and the insufficiency of the arguments here shows why. These arguments are based on the premise that the arts, like medicine, are self-sufficient. But this is not so. The doctor can produce health, but that health is good, he does not learn from medicine. And similarly with all of the arts. They deal with partial goods, which presuppose a knowledge of the whole good to which they minister. The error of the discussion was to look for a specific subject matter for justice, to make it one among many arts, to act as though only the doctor had anything to say about medicine. To help a sick friend, one needs not only a doctor, but someone who knows to whom health is fitting and how many other goods should be sacrificed to it, and who can direct the doctor to do what will most help the patient. There are master arts, which rule whole groups of ministerial arts and are necessary to them. This is what Aristotle calls architectonic arts. The carpenter, the mason, the roofer, all are in need of an architect, if a house is to be produced. He is more important than they are. He guides them, and he does not need to be a carpenter, a mason, or a roofer himself. Without the architect, all the other arts connected with the building lack an end and are useless or worse. Similarly, justice must be a master art, ruling the arts, which produce partial goods, so as to serve the whole good. In other words, justice must be knowledge of that good which none of the other arts knows, but which each presupposes. Lawgivers actually organize all the arts and tell their practitioners what they can and cannot do. What Socrates proposes is a legislative or political science. If each of the artisans obeys the law established by a legislator who is wise in this science, he would be just, and justice would take care of itself in law-abiding practice of the arts. In this way, the arts would provide what is fitting to each man. The very inadequacy of this argument, which divides the world among the arts without reflecting on that world which is divided, points to an art which does so. That art must be justice. Here, Socrates teaches that in order to be just, in the full sense, one must be a philosopher, and that philosophy is necessary to justice. Philosophy does have a subject matter, which helps in doing good to friends and harm to enemies, for it alone knows what is good or fitting, and it alone is not neutral, for by its very definition it seeks the whole good. Justice in this way would be knowledge, would be useful, and would not be able indifferently to produce opposite results. This is the solution which the argument compels us to seek, and a community of artisans ruled by philosophers would be one in which good would be done to friends. This solution, however, must wait until later, for Polemarchus really has no notion of what philosophy is, and its discovery is impossible on this level of thought. The poets and the laws tell Polemarchus the proper place of each thing, and this is why he sees no difficulty in doing good to friends. His is a pre-philosophic world, and its authorities must be completely discredited before philosophy can even be sought. After thoroughly confusing Polemarchus about the way to do good to friends and harm to enemies, Socrates turns to the question of what a friend is. He and Polemarchus agree that men consider as friends those they believe to be good. The problem is whether they must really be good men or only seem to be so in order to be friends. Polemarchus answers sensibly that the reality is not so important, but rather what is thought about it. Almost all men have friends, and many are not able to judge the true character of those they call friends. Friendship would be very rare if both parties had to be good men and know it. But from this simple admission follows a consequence which is intolerable to Polemarchus. To the extent that the just man erred about the goodness of men, he would benefit bad men and harm good ones, and hence be unjust. A simple reformulation solves the problem. Friends are properly those who appear to be good and are. But this little change, if it were taken seriously, would have the profoundest effects on Polemarchus's life. His first admission that his friends were those who seemed to him good reflected the way he really thinks. It is an easy-going outlook, typical of most men. He knows who friends are. Our friends are those around us, and the insistence that they must be good is a secondary consideration, one that has an abstract ring to it. The condition is admitted in speech, but has little effect in deed. And this means that men who loyally serve their friends are constantly and thoughtlessly doing injustice. This consequence cannot be avoided simply by making more effort, for Polemarchus's view is not merely a result of his laziness, but a product of his attachment to family and city. He makes the primitive identification of the good with his own. He is like his father, who wanted Socrates as a friend and invited him to become a member of his family. Men who are outsiders can become friends only by becoming naturalized members of the family. Blood ties are what count. Even the loyalty to the city is understood as an extension of the family. This tendency to see the good in one's own and to devote oneself to it is one of the most powerful urges of human nature and the source of great devotion and energy. Once the distinction between what is good and one's own is made, the principle of loyalty to family and city is undermined. In order to be just, one must seek good men wherever they may be, even in nations fighting one's own nation. If the good must be pursued, then caring for one's own must be extinguished, or it will make one unjust and impede the quest for the good. This undermines family and city, and they must attempt to prevent the distinction from even coming to light. Certainly Polemarchus would regard the abandonment of his primary loyalties as the destruction of the purpose and dignity of his life. If, however, he is to be consistent with the argument, he must make this sacrifice. A man who wishes to be just must be cosmopolitan. Thus far, Socrates has led us to the observation that in order to do good to friends and harm to enemies, one need only be a philosopher and give up one's attachment to those whom most men call friends. Now, he attacks the entire view implied by the definition. He asserts that no just man would harm anyone, thereby opposing his own understanding of justice to that of the gentleman. His is an utterly unpolitical view, one that seems to deny the distinction between friend and enemy. It takes no account of the desire to avenge insults and appears to be predicated on the notion that life is not essentially competitive. Socrates does not suggest that the just man would want to benefit all men, only that he would want to benefit his friends and to remain indifferent to the others. Polemarchus believes that it is impossible to benefit friends without harming enemies, for every city is in competition with other cities for the possession of scarce things. There cannot be cities without enemies, and a man cannot be a good citizen without wishing ill to his city's enemies. One can be indifferent to enemies if one divorces oneself from the city's perspective, and if the things one considers good are not threatened or scarce. Only the things of the mind are such as belong to all men, without necessary exclusion of some men and the war consequent on that exclusion. Nobody need take a man's knowledge from him in order to enjoy it, as one would have to do to make use of his money. Socrates' view is that of philosophy, in which knowledge is the highest good. Polemarchus' view is that of the city, in which property is the highest, at least the most needful good. In the concluding portion of their discussion, Socrates and Polemarchus actually have entirely different understandings of what it means to harm someone. Socrates says that to harm is to make a person or thing worse, with respect to his or its specific virtue. Justice, he asserts without proof, is human virtue. So to harm someone would be to make him more unjust. Correcting his earlier assertion that the arts are simply neutral, Socrates further asserts that the practitioners of arts are dedicated to goals which they cannot, to the extent they are true to their arts, ignore. Therefore, the just man cannot by justice make another man more unjust, and thus cannot harm him. Now, Polemarchus had no such notion in mind when he spoke of harming enemies. What he meant was taking the enemy's property or life, for those are the good things. Socrates' view is perfectly consistent with stealing from or killing an enemy just so long as he is not made more unjust. Socrates and Polemarchus differ about what is truly good. With all of Polemarchus's admiration for justice, it is not the highest thing, not sought for as such. Justice is more of a means to the end of preserving life and property than itself the end of a good life. Polemarchus's definition of justice might be regarded as the rule requisite to the satisfaction of collective selfishness. Be loyal to the members of your own group so that you can best take advantage of the outsiders. And in principle, there is no reason why this selfishness should not be extended to the individual if justice is not good in itself. This is why Socrates is able to claim that this definition, which seems so gentlemanly, is the product of a rich tyrant. If wealth is the goal, then the best way to attain it is by breaking all faith and seizing power in one city and conquering as many nations as one can. Only if justice is an end, not a means, is it reasonable to be unremittingly just. There is a tension in Polemarchus, of which he is unaware, between his love of property and his love of justice. This is what Socrates exposes, and what Thrasymachus is about to exploit. Justice, Thrasymachus says, is the morality of a band of robbers, who are face to face with their victims, and only a simpleton would be duped into making something more of it. Polemarchus is in an untenable position, somewhere between utter selfishness and total dedication to the common good. Gentlemanly morality is self-contradictory, and the goods desired by the gentleman would, if he were clear-sighted, lead in the direction of tyranny. Thrasymachus continues on the road to it, a road to which Socrates' questions have directed him. End quote. Okay, so there's more about Polemarchus. We've gotten quite a bit into the conversation with Polemarchus here. So to review, we start off talking about architectonic arts. The idea that there are other arts, like you've got a builder, a roofer, a mason building a house, but there has to be someone who's guiding what each of these artisans are doing. He equates that to the architect who's designing the house. And in terms of a society, the architects of the society would be the legislators. And so, in a sense, the art of justice is the art of the legislator, because those are the people who know what is good. Like, all these people can do good for a person in some particular way, but what the whole good of the person is and how all these things, right? Like, he talks a bit about health, and he says a doctor knows what's good for someone's health, but he's not one to say what should be sacrificed. In other words, whether someone should pay an exorbitant amount of money to fix a small health problem. That's a question that a doctor can't answer. That's a question of wisdom and judgment and valuing one thing against another. And so that's more of a broader view of what should the different arts do, and how should the person as a whole and the society as a whole be managed. So that's where the domain of justice is, and that is in the ultimate pursuit of the good of the individual and in the good of the community. I talk about the good of the community because Polemarchus is talking about what's good for his friends, and when they get to talking about what the friends are, they talk about kin groups and nations and families. But Socrates says you have to be a cosmopolitan. He says, in order to be just, one must seek good men wherever they may be. So if you're doing good to your friends, or whether you're doing good to your friends or you're doing good to good people, if you're benefiting unjust people, this is where kind of this question comes into play. If you're doing good things to benefit your friends, and your friends are unjust people, then you're benefiting unjust people and you're increasing injustice. You're benefiting the injustice that those people will pursue. You're rewarding them for their injustice. So in order to be just, you can't just do good things for your friends. You have to do good things for good people. And you have to be able to discern who good people are and what is going to benefit them, what is in their best interest. You have to become sort of all-knowing to pursue justice, right? And so there's a sense, I think, at least I get here, in which being honest would be to acknowledge that, like, pure justice is out of reach. We all are just inclined to benefit our family and our community and our nation and our friends, and to think about, like of course we think, oh, my friends are good people, but everybody thinks their friends are good people. Like, and you know what? That's okay. Like, it's okay to think that your friends are good people and want to do good things for them, because you have to make concessions to human nature in such a way that it constrains you from reaching this pure idealistic form of justice, that if some people somehow think they're going to reach this ultimate justice and like accommodate its demands, it demands that you become cosmopolitan, right? It demands that you give up your dedication to the nation, to your friends, to your family, right? It's all about the pursuit of justice wherever it may be found. And I think that's, like, to get to other episodes I've had in the past, that is a result of the single-mindedness of a dedication to justice. Any single-minded dedication to some single virtue at the expense of the other virtues leads to absurdity, and leads to ultimately, like, various things that can destroy civilization. Virtues have to be balanced against one another. Freedom, justice, and the other things, liberty, equality, the various things that we think we want, the various moral axes that we have, and the things we claim to be virtues, or the things we claim to be goals, or the things that are instinctive to us, have to be all balanced against one another, and none of them can ever be truly reached, but they can be set in harmony. So, you don't always have to only do good to good people. Sometimes it's okay to just do good to your friends and family, even if some of them are flawed individuals, because you're only human, and, like, you shouldn't make your life about devoting yourself to an idealized vision of justice. You get weird, distorted places like the Republic of Plato. So let's move on from there. when we finally introduce Thrasymachus. Here Allan Bloom says, quote, Thrasymachus bursts violently into the discussion. He is angry because Socrates and Polemarchus had been engaged in a dialogue. He sees this as a form of weakness. The participants in a dialogue obey certain rules, which, like laws, govern their association. They seek a common agreement, instead of trying to win a victory. The very art of dialectic seems to impose a kind of justice on those who practice it. Whereas rhetoric, the art of making long speeches without being questioned, Thrasymachus' art, is adapted to self-aggrandizement. Thrasymachus sees dialectic as an opponent of rhetoric and wishes to show his audience the superiority of rhetoric. Moreover, Thrasymachus objects to the substance as well as the form of what he has just heard. Justice, as doing good to others, fits in well with the self-abnegation of dialectic and is just as unsound. It is foolishness, the direct opposite of prudence, which causes a man to hold the position that justice is doing good to others, while also supposing that it is good for the doer. Thrasymachus adopts the accents of moral indignation in the cause of immorality. He charges Socrates with wrongdoing, with deceiving other men. Since Socrates' method is irony, he is a dissembler or a hypocrite. He imposes a higher good in which he himself does not believe, and would cause men and cities to neglect their needs and interests. Thrasymachus wishes to punish Socrates, and in a book teeming with allusions to Socrates' accusation and trial, Thrasymachus makes the most explicit condemnation of Socrates. His insistence that Socrates, if bested by Thrasymachus, propose an appropriate punishment for himself, prefigures that fateful day when the condemned Socrates is forced by the Athenian law to propose his own penalty. To Thrasymachus, as he will to the Athenian jurors, Socrates claims that he has no money, and now, as they will then, his friends offer to provide him with the necessary funds. Thrasymachus and the city are both angry at Socrates for not accepting their point of view, which appears to be as clear as day. The terms of the two accusations seem to be different, but it soon becomes evident that Thrasymachus' definition of justice is really the same as the city's, and that he acts as its representative. For as soon as he asserts that the just is the advantage of the stronger, he explains that by the stronger he means those who hold power in a city and constitute its sovereign, whether that sovereign consists of the people, the rich, the well-born, or a single man. The just is whatever the sovereign in its laws says is just. This is precisely what the city says, and Socrates is disloyal to both city and Thrasymachus in suggesting that justice goes beyond the law, that law may not even be necessary if wise men rule. This is a notion that is not only anti-legal, but is in particular anti-democratic, because it looks to the few wise rather than the many free. Thrasymachus insists that the decree of the sovereign is ultimate, and that there is no recourse beyond it, while Socrates insists that laws are just only to the extent they conform to a standard of justice superior to the laws and independent of the wishes of the sovereign. Thrasymachus' identification with the city's view of justice helps to explain his previously mentioned moral indignation in the cause of immorality, which also has its counterpart in the actions of the city. The city insists that its laws are just and punishes those who break them. Anger seems a proper reaction to lawbreakers, who are thought to harm others for their selfish ends. But Thrasymachus has stripped away the veils that covered the selfishness of the rulers and their laws. Those laws themselves serve the private interest of a part of the city and do harm to the rest of it. Laws are not directed to the common good. And yet the city will continue to put lawbreakers to death as unjust men and enemies of the common good. The anger awakened in men by the sight of indifference or hostility to law is a powerful force in protecting the law and hence the city. But it can also be the enemy of justice, and is certainly the greatest enemy of philosophy. Thrasymachus, whose art gives speech to the passions of the city, is its agent in condemning Socrates, and his action in the service of this passion imitates the city's action." End quote. So this, interestingly, Thrasymachus bursts on the scene in an angry manner. He's angry at the fact that they're having a conversation because he thinks it's weak. But ultimately, he is a supporter of power. And he says that justice. He says that there's no way to look beyond the laws of the city to see what is just. It doesn't matter. You'll be punished for breaking the laws of the city one way or the other. There is no way to find some higher law of justice that the city itself is obligated to. If the city says do something and you don't do it, you do something else, then you've broken the laws and you deserve to be punished. And that's the end of the story. And so Thrasymachus basically says, it's whatever the sovereign wants. The city is constituted in such a way that the people or the representatives of the people or the oligarchs or the king or whoever has this sovereign law-giving power, the legislators, etc. You don't have the capacity. It's not just for you to second guess what they've told you. It's just for you to do what you're told, because justice is the will of the powerful. Now, we hear this and we think it's kind of rather odd, but there's also some truth to it, because once you're appealing to something beyond the law, what are you appealing to besides your own opinion? What can you point to? And maybe people have various arguments about morality that transcend the law, but in a sense, you're sort of pointing to your opinion about what is just. And in a realm of vague things like a definition of justice, the best you can hope for is the will of the powerful. So that's kind of Thrasymachus's argument. Now, Socrates, of course, has a response for this. Socrates responds to Thrasymachus in the following way. He says, quote, "The immediate cause of Thrasymachus's ire is the end of Socrates' argument with Polemarchus. Based on the tacit premise that justice is good, the argument led to the conclusion that justice is an art that does good to those to whom it ministers. The just man profits both others and himself. This means that there is a common good. The community is bound together by justice, and no one sacrifices his own personal advantage to it. On the contrary, if, to use Socrates' hyperbolic expression, justice is human virtue, each gains his fulfillment in the prosperity of the whole. A just man never harms anyone." Thrasymachus, referring to his knowledge of the world and of the actual practice of the cities, treats this view as the result of a culpable innocence, an innocence destructive to the happiness of those who are taken in by it. Practically speaking, as Cephalus's example shows, justice is law-abidingness. That is certainly what the city says it is. And even if there is a natural justice, it must be embodied in a code of political law in order to have a real effect. The city always presents its laws as a constitutive part of itself, like the territory and the populace. But in fact, these laws can vary, as the territory and the populace cannot. They are a function of the regime, of the kind of men who govern the city. When the poor, or the rich, or the old families, or a tyrant take over the rule in a city, its laws change correspondingly. The sovereign makes the laws, and those laws always happen to reflect its interests. Oligarchies make laws which favor and protect oligarchy. Democracy makes laws which favor and protect democracy, etc. The regime is the absolute beginning point. There is nothing beyond it. To understand the kind of justice practiced in any city, one must look to the regime. The laws have their source in the human all too human. He who obeys them in reverence or in fear is simply serving the advantage of the stronger, whether the stronger is a single man, or the great majority of the people, or any other politically relevant group within the city. If this is to be the case, however, prudence and self-interest would seem to dictate to the individual that either he should try to evade the law, or else become the lawmaker himself. Thrasymachus's thesis is simply that the regime makes the laws, and that the members of the regime look to their own good and not the common good. The city is not a unity, but a composite of opposed parties. And the party which wins out over the others is the source of the law. There is no fundamental difference between tyranny and other regimes because they all have the same selfish end. Justice, therefore, is not a fundamental phenomenon. The lawgiver cannot base himself upon it, for justice is a result of the law. Socrates does not deny that it is the stronger who rule and establish the law. He silently accepts the view that all existing regimes are as Thrasymachus says they are. The two men thus agree that the character of the ruling group is the core of politics, that the rulers are the stronger, and that justice is a political phenomenon and must be embodied in the laws of a city. The issue between them is whether all rulers, all lawgivers, must be selfish in the way Thrasymachus insists they are. From this point on, the question is the regime. Who rules? And Socrates tries to find a kind of man, a political class, which is both strong and public-spirited. Socrates turns then to the criticism of Thrasymachus' view of the rulers. He quickly succeeds in embarrassing him by the reflection that sometimes rulers make mistakes. Hence, obedience to the law may be as much to their disadvantage as their advantage. Justice is not the advantage of the stronger, unless the stronger, or the rulers, know what their own advantage is. The emphasis now shifts from strength to knowledge. Socrates' question appears to refer to rulers' mistakes about the means to their ends, but could apply to mistakes about the proper ends of action. Socrates then is also asking whether the rulers really know what is advantageous, and leads Thrasymachus into a region of profound problems on which he has hardly reflected. Like Polemarchus, he takes it for granted that the most common objects of desire, particularly whatever has to do with wealth, are advantageous, and that knowledge of them is a given. Thrasymachus is the more thoughtful voice of the most thoughtless opinions and desires. He teaches an art by means of which men can get those good things, and a mistaken ruler for him would be one who did not know the appropriate means to the given ends. He wishes to educate a clever, selfish man who knows how to get what he wants. But as Socrates will show, this artisan of selfish satisfaction is not really in harmony with the vulgar tastes Thrasymachus is also committed to supporting. It is by developing this contradiction that Socrates will be able to tame the wild beast. Thrasymachus could easily have circumvented the difficulty which Socrates presents. The crude Cleitophon, who enters to defend Thrasymachus, shows Polemarchus, who is now Socrates' ally and defender, how obvious this route is. Thrasymachus had only to say, as Cleitophon insists he meant, that justice is what appears to be to the advantage of the stronger. This position is closer to that of legal positivism. The just is what the city says is just and nothing more. Cleitophon asserts that laws established by the rulers are based on their apparent advantage. This position may not be true, but it does not defy common sense, and it seems based on the actual practice of cities. The thesis merely asserts that the only source and sanction of law is the sovereign, and that it is hence benighted to look for higher justification. There is no need to define rulers by any criterion other than their having the power to make laws in the city, and the question of what is truly advantageous is set aside. Cleitophon's solution to Socrates' difficulty does not contain those internal contradictions which bring about Thrasymachus' downfall. Thrasymachus, however, chooses to respond to Socrates' objection by arguing that the ruler is always right and knows his own advantage. The ruler who makes mistakes is not a ruler. That is, almost all rulers are not really rulers. It is not that rulers do behave with scientific selfishness, but that they should. Thrasymachus, as it were, anticipates Socrates' best regime by developing an alternative opposed to it. As in Socrates' good city, where rulers will be trained who are perfectly public-spirited, so in Thrasymachus' there will be rulers who are perfectly selfish. The rulers in both regimes do have in common, however, the fact that they are knowers. Thrasymachus' regime as is improbable and opposed to experience, as is Socrates, rather than defend the plausible observation that rulers of selfish intention are the source of law. Thrasymachus encumbers himself with the responsibility for what amounts to a moral imperative, requiring rulers to be selfish with perfect knowledge. Why does Thrasymachus do so? In the first place, he has simply thought through the consequences of his position, unlike the advocates of a crude positivism. If law has no deeper authority than human convention, any man who reflects at all on what kind of life he should live realizes he cannot rely on the law for guidance. Every man reasonably pursues his own good, and if there is no common good, he will properly use the law for his own private satisfaction. This is the lesson which the individual can well draw from the teaching that law is nothing more than the sovereign's will. And the intelligent tyrant seems to be the one who has best learned the lesson. The ruler is hence a man who seeks his own advantage. To do so is almost the only alternative, since other goals are illusory. If he fails to attain it, he is a failure as a ruler and a man. Thrasymachus looks at politics from the point of view of the man who wants to live well and has understood the nature of justice. It is this perspective which causes him to go beyond Cleitophon's formulation. Further, to the extent that in this drama Thrasymachus plays the role of the city, he echoes the city's insistence that it knows the truth. For the city could hardly admit that its laws are essentially fallible. Its pronouncements must be authoritative, and all knowledge, divine or human, must be ratified and codified by the sovereign. It has a monopoly of wisdom, otherwise every individual would have an appeal from it. And finally, Thrasymachus, as the practitioner and teacher of an art, one which he believes to be the most important art for men who want to live a good life, must make a claim himself to possess knowledge and to be able to convey that knowledge to others. As Socrates suggests, he is in Athens looking for students whose money he needs in order to live. He directs his appeal to noble political youths of high ambition. They wish to be rulers. But if there is no art, the possession of which makes a man a ruler and enables him to attain the good sought for in the activity of ruling, what would Thrasymachus have to teach them? Cleitophon's argument implies that the ruler is defined only by holding office, not by any particular skill which gives him the capacity to attain this end. This would be disastrous for Thrasymachus' profession. He therefore claims he teaches a skill which can make men rulers, in the sense that they will be able to fulfill their wishes. The ordinary ruler is potentially the completely successful, selfish ruler. He cannot be understood without reference to this end, any more than the doctor can be understood without reference to the end of curing sick men. A ruler who errs about his advantage is not, as such, a ruler, any more than a mathematician who errs in calculation is, as such, a mathematician. Thrasymachus promises political success to his students. His definition of the rulers, in the precise sense, is part of his professional propaganda. End quote. So there you have basically Socrates' response about whether or not the ruler is actually making laws to benefit himself. It's not. He talks about what's to the advantage of the powerful. Justice is whatever is in the powerful's interest. But Socrates rightly says, well, they don't always know what's in their own best interest. They might make mistakes and do the wrong things. And so is justice following the law that isn't actually to their advantage? Now, Allan Bloom says the obvious response is what Cleitophon says when he jumps in, that justice is whatever the law says, and it doesn't matter what's to their advantage or not to their advantage. That's not the question. The question is what is justice, and justice. There's no claim here to that justice must be to the advantage of the ruling class. No. If no one has access to justice outside the law, if no one has access to a deeper, more profound justice, then it just boils down to whoever's in power makes the rules, and that's justice. So in a sense, Thrasymachus is saying there is no deeper justice. But he gets confused because he tries to talk about what's to their advantage. But the idea here is that, well, that's his profession. He proposes to teach people how to become rulers. He has to be able to teach them what, is in their advantage. He has to know what is in their advantage and how they can get it. So in a sense, he has to be able to teach potential politicians what is in their best interest. So he has to make the case that they're able to know what's in their best interests. They can find out by studying Thrasymachus. He has to believe in their capacity to seek and acquire advantage. So as the discussion of what justice is proceeds, eventually we get to kind of the core question of whether justice is good, whether justice is beneficial to people who are just. Is it beneficial to a just man to be just? Is justice its own thing that should be sought after for its own sake? Does it, or even if it doesn't provide benefit, does it or doesn't it, and whether it should be pursued even if it doesn't? That's an important question. Like, why are we even after justice? I think that is a little bit of unnecessary to dig too far into that, whether it's beneficial to be just, because I kind of go back to the moral sense theory that injustice feels wrong, justice feels right in a certain part of our brains, and there are benefits to being just, but there are also benefits to being unjust, and that's the reason why we're not entirely just creatures. We've evolved to have bits of justice and bits of injustice in us because at different times they've benefited us differently. So I don't think it's too fruitful of a conversation for me at this time getting into whether justice is good. I'll just sort of settle on the answer mostly, but not entirely. At times yes, at times no. And there's a sort of science of understanding when justice should be set aside for other things, and that's the art of politics. And that's that question is a little bit outside the domain of where I want to go in this episode. So thanks a lot for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.